Hello YouTube. In this video I'm going to look at an interesting challenge to moral realism, the problem of moral deference. So this was presented by Sarah McGrath in her article Skepticism about Moral Expertise as a Puzzle for Moral Realism. Now, before we get into that, a quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon or with a one-off donation on PayPal. I offer private tutoring in philosophy. Email if you're interested, and if you want to talk about any of this stuff, join the Discord. A link will be in the comments. Okay then, let's get into it. So, first of all, moral realism. Well, here we're going to define moral realism as the view that some moral judgments are true, and moral judgments are made true by stance-independent moral facts. The moral facts are discovered, not invented. The moral facts are independent of what any particular individuals think about them. So, for example, it is a fact that slavery is wrong, and slavery would be wrong even if everybody believed that slavery was acceptable. That's the kind of view that we're talking about here. I mean, if you're not familiar with the distinction between moral realism and moral anti-realism, you can check out my earlier videos on Metaethics. Again, I'll put a link in the comments. Okay, then that's moral realism. Now, McGrath suggests that reflection on the nature of moral expertise casts doubt on moral realism. So, to see why this is, consider how expertise works in non-moral contexts. Generally, when we aim to form beliefs about the way the world is, it's considered appropriate, indeed in some cases you might even say that it's like obligatory, to form beliefs by deferring to the testimony of others. You trust other people, basically. So think about, facts about biology, about the common ancestor of two species or the mechanisms of DNA replication or whatever. If a biologist tells me that human beings are more closely related to chimpanzees than they are to gorillas, well, that's a reason for me to believe that human beings are indeed more closely related to chimpanzees than they are to gorillas. So, my belief can be based on what the biologist has said. I can recognize that this person, has relevant expertise on this topic, and I trust them. Or, for a more practical example, think about deferring to a tax specialist about how to fill out tax forms. I don't know anything about tax myself. I just trust what the tax specialist tells me. I mean, this should be, there's nothing unusual about this, right? Like, a lot of our beliefs about the world are formed on the basis of the testimony of others. We just trust what other people tell us. When I need to determine what I owe on tax, I can collect the relevant information and give it to somebody else to work out. So, in general, deference seems fine. By contrast, it doesn't seem appropriate to form moral beliefs on the basis of testimony from others. So, suppose that Verity is wondering whether euthanasia is morally permissible. She asks her friend Sydney, who is a moral philosopher, and Sydney says, yes, euthanasia is morally permissible. And on that basis alone, Verity comes to believe that euthanasia is morally permissible. Well, that does seem like a strange way for Verity to proceed. When it comes to morality, we expect people to come to their own conclusions about moral matters. We don't just defer to other people. Not even people who we might think of as being experts in some sense. Like, again, Sydney's a moral philosopher, so he's studied this subject. But even so, you wouldn't just defer to him. Now, I mean, of course, there are going to be cases where testimony of others is relevant to our moral beliefs. So suppose that Verity is deliberating about euthanasia, but she is unsure whether euthanasia can be performed painlessly. Sydney's a doctor, and he confirms that yes, there are painless procedures. Well, that might affect Verity's belief in the morality of euthanasia, but in this case, Verity is not forming a moral belief on the basis of testimony. Rather, she's forming a belief about certain non-moral facts. So the non-moral facts are to do with whether or not euthanasia can be performed painlessly, and then that influences her moral beliefs. I mean, it's also perfectly fine if Verity asks Sydney for his view about whether euthanasia is permissible, and then Sydney gives reasons for his view, and these reasons convince Verity to agree with him. In this case, Verity does form a moral belief, but not on the basis of Sydney's testimony. She forms her belief on the basis of reasons that Sydney has provided. So Sydney might say, for instance, oh, well, we euthanize animals to end pointless suffering and we consider that humane. Why not allow the same dignity to human beings? So if Sydney says something like that, and on that basis Verity comes to agree that euthanasia is acceptable, then the point is she's not just trusting Sydney's testimony, right? She's forming her belief that euthanasia is acceptable on the basis of the reasoning that Sydney has outlined. What seems problematic, what seems strange, is for Verity to say something like, well, Sydney is a better moral judge than me, so if Sydney says that euthanasia is permissible, then I will believe that euthanasia is permissible. Or if she says, I know that euthanasia is permissible because Sydney says so. There's something fishy about this. So what's problematic, according to McGrath, is the idea of a person forming their moral values on the basis of testimony from others. So there's something weird about a person letting other people decide their values for them. So, as McGrath puts it, the question is, if it is fine to defer to a tax specialist when one's finances get complicated, why is it not equally appropriate to defer to a moral specialist when one's life gets complicated in morally significant ways? So here's a puzzling piece of data, right? A puzzling datum. Moral deference is more problematic than deference in other domains. More precisely, Wesley Buckwalter, in the article Doubting Deference, identifies two core claims of this datum. So first of all, there's the deviance claim, which says that there's something problematic about moral deference. And then there's the distinctiveness claim, which says that deviance arises in virtue of distinctive features of the moral domain. So this is the deference datum. Okay then, so why is all of that supposed to be a problem for moral realism? Well, the question is, how do we explain this deference datum? Arguably, moral anti-realists have a pretty easy time with this. So consider non-cognitivism. According to non-cognitivism, moral judgments do not express genuine beliefs, but are instead expressions of attitudes of approval or disapproval. So if I judge that euthanasia is wrong, I'm not really attributing the property of wrongness to euthanasia. Instead, what I mean is just something like, boo to euthanasia. Now, obviously, boo to euthanasia, that's not true or false, or at least it certainly isn't made true or false by stance-independent moral facts. Now, for the non-cognitivist, the deference datum, it seems, is fairly easily explained, because when I judge that euthanasia is wrong, I'm expressing a negative attitude to euthanasia. And although I can defer to others when it comes to my beliefs, it's not clear that it's even possible to defer to others with respect to attitudes. I mean, certainly I can't express a negative attitude if I don't actually have the negative attitude. I can't, like if I know that some other person holds a negative attitude to euthanasia, that's not something that I can express. I can only express my own attitudes. But yeah, I mean, like, the fact that somebody else has a particular attitude, like an attitude of disapproval, I mean, I'm not going to then form an attitude of disapproval on that basis, or at least that would be weird, right? It would be very odd to defer to others with respect to attitudes. That's what a non-cognitivist might say. Or consider moral fictionalism. Moral fictionalists will say that moral judgments do express beliefs, but there are no moral properties, so all moral judgments are false. We can continue using moral language because it is a useful fiction. There's some other purpose that's served by employing this framework of morality. Now, obviously, I can elaborate a fiction in pretty much whatever ways I want. So when I'm creating a fiction, there are no facts that a fiction is going to be answerable to. Like, a fiction doesn't have to track the way the world is, I mean, that's that's pretty much definitional of what fiction is. It doesn't have to have any relation to what the facts are. So for a moral fictionalist, there are no facts that moral language can even in principle be answerable to. There are no moral truths to be found. So, there are no moral experts. There are no people who would have correct beliefs about the moral facts. And that's why it wouldn't make any sense to defer to others, right? Because if you're deferring to somebody, if you're deferring to somebody with respect to your beliefs about some given domain, then the assumption has to be that this person is likely to have correct beliefs about that domain. But for a moral fictionalist, there are no correct moral beliefs. Okay, so now consider moral realism. Well, if we're realists, there does seem to be a bit of a challenge here. Because when we are deliberating about the way the world is, when there are independent facts of the matter that we can get right or wrong, we often do defer to experts. So in general, we recognize that within any given factual domain, there are people who are in a better position than us to discover the facts. So we defer to their judgments. If there are moral facts, and if these facts can in principle be discovered by us, then we should expect that there are moral experts who are better placed to discover the moral facts. And if there are moral experts, then it would be responsible to defer to them. Indeed, it's not just that deference would be acceptable. It's like, we actually ought to defer to them. When we recognize that somebody is, better informed or in a better position to discover the facts, then yeah, I ought to defer to them. So the deference datum raises a challenge to moral realism, because when there are independent facts about some domain D, it is reasonable to defer to other people who are experts about that domain when forming beliefs about that domain. But moral deference doesn't seem reasonable, or there's something strange about moral deference. Forming moral values on the basis of the testimony of others would be a very weird way of proceeding. So how does the realist explain this, right? How can the realist account for the sort of fact that on the one hand they're claiming that there are these stance independent moral facts, but on the other hand we just don't defer to others when forming moral beliefs? So we're going to look at some of the potential responses available to realists, and one option is, well, we might notice that one context in which deference is rare is when the facts in question are obvious or trivial. So think about really basic facts about the empirical world, so a claim like I have two hands, or basic facts about arithmetic like 1 + 1 = 2. Deference would be odd in these cases, partly because these facts are so easily accessible to every normal person. In these cases, there's just no need to defer. So I'm like, when it comes to a belief like I have two hands, the thought would be, well, nobody could be in a better position than I am to determine whether or not I have two hands. Similarly, nobody could be in a better position than I am to determine that 1 + 1 = 2. One way to look at this is that with respect to these beliefs, we're all experts. So that's why you don't defer to others. There's just nobody who, you're not going to say, oh yeah, this person probably knows better than I do whether or not I have two hands. That would be really weird. So perhaps the realist could say that similarly, the moral facts are easily available to everybody. Moral facts are trivial or obvious, and that's why moral deference seems deviant. Now, the obvious problem with this response is that, well, there's plenty of moral disagreement. It seems like reasonable people can hold quite different moral positions. Moral judgments just don't seem analogous to these trivial, obvious, commonsensical claims like I have two hands. If there are moral facts, they aren't that trivial. Now, of course, we might argue that there are some moral facts that are trivial. Like, some philosophers have suggested that there's no sensible doubt about basic claims such as there is pro tanto reason not to torture innocent children, right? So maybe that's just really obvious and nobody can doubt that. But, it would... So, okay, we can explain why it would be odd to defer in that specific case, but it's also odd to defer to others with respect to non-trivial moral claims. It would be odd to defer with respect to the morality of euthanasia or capital punishment, but those questions aren't trivial, right? Is capital punishment right or wrong? That's not just a trivial question. So yeah, the appeal to sort of trivial facts doesn't really seem to do the job. Okay, a second option suggested by McGrath is that a realist might say that there is nothing wrong in principle with deferring to moral experts. The problem is that in practice, we just don't have any reliable means of determining who the moral experts are. In other domains, so in domains where it is natural to defer to others, such as mathematics, I can very easily identify the relevant experts. There are people who have received qualifications in the subject, or who can just immediately demonstrate their skill by solving mathematical problems or whatever. I have very clear criteria for figuring out the mathematical experts. In the moral domain, well, are there moral experts? Maybe, but even if there are, it's not clear what the criteria are for identifying them. And so, I'm not going to have any reason to believe that any given person will have a better understanding of morality than I do. There's no reason to believe, at least, that any given person will be more likely to hold correct moral beliefs, and that's why it's unreasonable for me to defer. Now, in response to this, McGrath says, well, the problem with this response is that the peculiarity of moral deference doesn't seem as contingent as this response suggests. So if this expertise response is right, then we should expect that if I were to become more confident that a particular person is a moral expert, then I would have no trouble deferring to her judgment about moral matters. But McGrath says, well, we wouldn't expect this to happen. Indeed, I can identify people who I think have a deep understanding of morality, maybe because they've studied moral theories in detail, or they've dealt with practical moral issues in a sensitive way. I can identify people who I tend to agree with more often than not, but I'm not going to defer to their moral judgments. And I suppose the more general issue here is why exactly we take it that there's some special difficulty identifying moral experts, because there are people who have devoted themselves to studying morality. There are moral philosophers. There are people who can show that they are, careful thinkers, right? They're able to reason logically, to sort of construct valid arguments, to see relevant conceptual distinctions. They're able to understand how to apply abstract theories in practical cases, and so on. We can identify people who can do these things. Now, as far as realists are concerned, there are moral facts, and it seems like these people, the people who've studied the subject, who are very careful thinkers, etc., these people would be best placed to uncover the moral facts. They're the people that we should be deferring to, right? Why not defer to them in the way that we defer to mathematicians, who we take it understand the mathematical facts? McGrath is going to say that this appeal to kind of difficulty identifying moral experts isn't going to work either. A third response is what we might call the knowledge how response. So philosophers distinguish between knowledge that and knowledge how. Knowledge that is propositional knowledge. So knowledge that involves not knowing that certain propositions are true. So I know that the Earth orbits the barycenter of the solar system. I know that Frank Zappa was a musician. I know that I have two hands. So this is knowledge of the truth of propositions. Knowledge how is a matter of skills and abilities. I know how to ride a bike. Notice that somebody could have a lot of propositional knowledge about how bikes work. They could know lots of true propositions about the functioning of bikes without actually knowing how to ride a bike. So similarly, McGrath says, there's a distinction between moral knowledge that and moral knowledge how. And McGrath gives the example of a child who comes to believe that lying is wrong on the basis of her parents' testimony. So this child has knowledge that lying is wrong. She knows the proposition lying is wrong. But the child does not understand why lying is wrong. She's just formed her belief on the basis of what her parents have said. So she just has a belief in this proposition. But this means that the child will probably be unable to apply her moral knowledge correctly. She will lack moral knowledge how. So to see how this works, right? So we might say, okay, yes, it's true that lying is wrong, but there are going to be exceptional circumstances in which lying is permissible, right? So it's generally true, lying is wrong, but there are all kinds of situations where, it's going to be blameless or it's going to be okay. And the ability to recognize these situations, the ability to distinguish the special circumstances where lying is okay, that seems to require understanding why lying is wrong. If a person just holds the belief lying is wrong, if they just believe that proposition, they won't have any ability to identify these circumstances. So the child is going to be insensitive to the reasons that outweigh the wrongness of lying. Or consider the question of, well, what exactly counts as a lie in the first place? Recognizing which actions count as lying is, again, that's going to depend on sort of understanding and sensitivity to the features that make lying wrong. So think about how we identify cases of lying by omission. Lying isn't always a matter of stating things that you think are false, right? Sometimes you can lie by just not saying anything. You can lie by omission, but it requires a great deal of sort of, sophistication and sensitivity and so on to identify these sorts of cases. So the child who simply believes lying is wrong will be unable to apply her knowledge correctly. She will know that lying is wrong, but not know how to, react in actual cases of lying. So this is McGrath's suggestion then is that in order to apply the moral knowledge that P correctly, you need to understand why P is true. In order to apply the moral knowledge that lying is wrong correctly, you need to understand why it's true that lying is wrong. And in general then, the idea is that morality is going to be more a matter of knowing how. It's more a matter of skill or ability. And this is because the purpose of morality is to guide our actions. When we think about morality, we're not just constructing these abstract theories of the world. We're trying to figure out what we should do, how we should act in particular situations. And the person whose moral beliefs are formed through deference is going to be impoverished in this respect. More generally, McGrath points out that it's part of ordinary moral thought that it matters why agents perform the actions that they do. Even when I perform the right action, it makes a difference what my reasons are. So think about the case of the shopkeeper who always gives his customers the correct change because he is genuinely honest, because he cares about treating other people fairly, versus the shopkeeper who gives his customers the correct change merely because he wants to maintain a reputation for honesty. We will usually judge the actions of the first shopkeeper to be better than the actions of the second. Like the first shopkeeper is more virtuous. So then the issue with moral deference is when you form beliefs on the basis of deference, even if you have the right beliefs about what is the right thing to do, you won't know the reasons why it's the right thing to do. So you won't be doing the right thing for the right reasons. You're not sensitive to the features that make it the right thing to do, and that is a deficiency. So we can distinguish sort of three cases, right? There's case one. In case one, there's the agent who does the right thing for the wrong reasons. That's the case of the greedy shopkeeper. In case two, there's the agent who does the right thing merely because it's right. And then in case three, there's the agent who does the right thing for the reasons that make it right. Now, clearly, it's better to do the right thing than, it's better to do the right thing than the wrong thing. Moreover, clearly, the second option here is better than the first, right? It's better to do the right thing because it is right than to do the right thing for the wrong reasons. So the person in case two does care about morality for its own sake, but the ideal is case three. In case three, you're doing the right thing for the reasons that make it right. And if you form beliefs on the basis of deference, you're inevitably going to fall short of this. The child who's formed this belief that lying is wrong, they might be able to, act in accordance with case two, but they're never going to reach case three. They're never going to do the right thing for the reasons that make it right. So one concern about this response, as noted by McGrath, is that, well, deference also seems strange, even when the moral claim in question is already tailored to a specific case. So I might defer to the claim that, for instance, it's wrong for me to eat this particular piece of meat on my plate, right? And in that case, it doesn't seem like there's any need for interpretation or understanding. There's no need to figure out any sort of further reasons, right? I already know exactly what I should do in this particular situation. So, like one worry was, well, there's this worry about how if you form beliefs on the basis of deference, then you're not going to be able to know how to apply your moral knowledge. But if you defer with respect to some specific claim, then there's no issue about how to apply your knowledge. It already is applied. Another objection to this knowing how response is to say, well, it doesn't seem like there's actually a difference between the moral and non-moral domains in this respect. So take a simple empirical claim such as water boils at 100 degrees centigrade. Okay, so it seems reasonable to defer to expert testimony with respect to this claim. But of course, there are plenty of exceptions to this. I mean, if the water has certain kinds of impurities, or if you're climbing a mountain and the atmospheric pressure is lower, or if the water has been superheated. Actually, there are loads of contexts where water does not boil at 100 degrees centigrade. So a person who simply believes the proposition, water boils at 100 degrees, they will not be able to apply their empirical knowledge to specific cases. They won't know how to work with water in specific cases. And we can similarly sort of distinguish between, so there's the case where, you know, an agent believes that water boils at 100 degrees merely because they've been told by an expert. So they have the correct beliefs, and maybe they care about having the correct beliefs, right? But they just believe the proposition that water boils at 100 degrees because that's what they've been told. And then there's the case of an agent who believes that water boils at 100 degrees because they've assessed the evidence, they've read the literature, they've maybe performed their own experiments, so they have practical knowledge of water and boiling and so on. Well, clearly the ideal is the second case, right? There's something deficient about forming beliefs merely on the basis of testimony from others. You fail to reach an ideal. Somebody who believes merely on the basis of testimony from others is inevitably going to fall short of the ideal, right? But even so, there's nothing problematic about this. It's perfectly fine for people to form beliefs about, you know, the boiling point of water on the basis of testimony from others. There's nothing unusual about that in the way that moral deference is supposedly unusual. So we might think that this knowledge how response doesn't account for like the difference between what's supposedly problematic about moral deference and deference in other cases. Okay then, so a fourth way that the realist might respond is to deny that realism has any deny that there's anything especially problematic for a realist with respect to the deference datum. So the claim that we made earlier was that anti-realists can easily explain the deference datum. But we might doubt this, right? It's not actually so obvious that anti-realists can give a simple explanation for the deference datum. So let's think again about non-cognitivism. So the non-cognitivist says moral judgments express attitudes of approval or disapproval. Well, obviously I can't hold an attitude just because some other person holds that attitude. That's fair enough. But, you know, pretty much all contemporary non-cognitivists will allow that morality is it's a little more sophisticated than mere expression of an attitude, right? Like, so yes, like ultimately moral judgments are going to be based on attitudes, but when you make moral judgments, you're not merely expressing attitudes. In particular, people can engage in moral reasoning. So suppose I'm currently undecided on euthanasia. Then I think through the arguments for it and against it. These arguments are going to be based presumably on my attitudes. Like ultimately I'm appealing to my values, my attitudes, but I'm sort of weighing things up. You know, I'm weighing up. I notice that maybe my attitudes point in one direction in one case, in another direction in another case, and I've got to weigh things up. So I think about these arguments for and against euthanasia, and I decide that the arguments in favour of it weigh more heavily. So I become inclined to judge that euthanasia is permissible. You know, thinking through these arguments like changes my attitude, or it pushes my attitude in a particular direction. Well, if that's possible, and it clearly is possible, clearly people do engage in moral reasoning, why not deference? So let's say I'm currently undecided on euthanasia, then I ask somebody who I consider to be a moral expert, and they tell me that euthanasia is permissible, and then that makes me inclined to judge that euthanasia is permissible. Why couldn't that happen? It seems like that That's entirely possible, right? Like, so if it's possible for me to become inclined to judge euthanasia as permissible on the basis of weighing up reasons for and against it, why not through deferring to the testimony from somebody else? So actually, it's not clear that the non-cognitivist can give any simple explanation of the deference datum. Or take moral fictionalism. The moral fictionalist says all moral judgments are false, but that we can continue to make moral judgments because morality is a useful fiction. Now the question here is, well, what purpose exactly does this fiction serve? Because when we engage in this moral fiction, we're not just telling a story. It's not like I'm just sitting down telling a story in the way that you might sit down and tell a story about Sherlock Holmes. There's some further point to engaging in morality. There's some purpose it's supposed to be serving. And, different moral fictionalists will say different things here, but a common sort of line is to say, well, the point of the moral fiction is that it promotes peace or it promotes social stability or something like that, right? If we all act as if morality were true, if we pretend that morality is true, then that's going to promote peace and social stability, and that's something that we want. So the thing is that whatever goal we cite for the fiction, there are going to be facts about what kinds of fiction will best achieve that goal. So some moral theories will be better at achieving peace and social stability than others. But then that's precisely the sort of question on which it seems reasonable to defer to experts. So the question here is, which set of rules would best promote peace and social stability? Well, in that case, sociologists, psychologists, economists, they seem like relevant experts. If morality is a fiction, which we are using to promote some other end, then it seems we should be deferring to those who have expertise about that end. So, for moral fictionalists, the deference datum is not so easily explained, it seems. Now, of course, there's much more that could be said about both of these positions, and there are other anti-realist positions, relativism, constructivism, whatever. And maybe those other positions are better placed to explain the deference datum. The point I'm making here is just, it's not obvious that the deference datum is any less puzzling for anti-realists than it is for realists. And if it's not any less puzzling for anti-realists than it is for realists, then we don't have an argument against realism here. Okay then, a final response to the puzzle of deference is to simply reject the deference datum. We might just deny that there is anything uniquely problematic about moral deference relative to deference in other domains. So we would say that this supposed puzzle just never arises. This response is given by Wesley Buckwater in his article Doubting Deference. Buckwater raises a number of concerns about the deference claim. I will mention just a few of them. So a first concern is that there are non-moral domains where deference seems deviant as well. Arguably, for example, deference is just as problematic with respect to philosophical positions. So consider questions like, what is the correct metaphysical theory, physicalism or idealism? Do humans have free will? Are there moral facts? Is all knowledge derived from sense experience? These philosophical questions, it seems in these cases, it would be weird to defer to others. So suppose I come to believe that idealism is true simply on the basis of testimony from a philosopher who defends idealism, or I come to believe that compatibilism is the right account of free will simply on the basis of testimony from a philosopher who defends compatibilism. This seems just as weird as forming moral beliefs on the basis of testimony. But the interesting thing here is that in the case of philosophy, well, we're perfectly happy with the idea that there's a fact of the matter which philosophical positions are correct. We take it with with these questions, we think, or at least with some of them, right? With some, for at least some philosophical questions, we think, okay, there's a fact of the matter whether physicalism or idealism is the right metaphysical theory. So there is some independent fact that we can get right or wrong. In that sense, we are realists about this question. But in this case, deference is just as weird as it is in the moral case. So then there's nothing uniquely strange about moral deference. A second concern that Buckwalter raises is that the examples that are used to illustrate the deference datum are cherry-picked to suggest a difference between moral and non-moral cases where in fact there may be none. So earlier in the video I gave this example of deferring to somebody about the moral status of euthanasia versus deferring to somebody about taxes. But obviously there are a number of differences between moral questions about euthanasia and then the institutions and norms relating to tax law. They differ in terms of their complexity, in terms of the legal regulations, in terms of their relation to social conventions, their role in our everyday lives. So if we notice that in one case deference is problematic and in the other case deference is not problematic, and then we're asking, well, why is there this difference, right? Why is deference okay in one case but not in the other? Well, it could be for any number of reasons. There's a huge number of differences between these cases, and like any of these differences might be what is underlying our intuition that deference is okay in one case but not okay in the other. So Buckwalter says that in order to give proper support to the deference datum, we have to consider comparisons that are more closely matched in terms of content. Ideally, we want to consider two cases where the only relevant difference between the cases is that one concerns a moral belief and the other concerns a non-moral belief. We want to make it so that the only difference, the only relevant difference, is in terms of whether we're forming a moral belief or a non-moral belief. Of course, in practice, it's hard to come up with cases where that is the only relevant difference, but we can construct cases that are a bit more closely matched in terms of content than, okay, like deference about morality of euthanasia versus deference to a tax specialist. So Buckwalter gives this example. Okay, case one, the moral case. Sarah is trying to decide whether eating meat is morally wrong for society. She considers the issue very carefully but does not reach a decision. She asks a trusted moral advisor who tells her that it is definitely morally wrong. Because of what the advisor said, she decides that eating meat is morally wrong. Case two, the financial case. Sarah is trying to decide whether eating meat is financially costly for society. She considers the issue very carefully but does not reach a decision. She asks a trusted economic advisor who tells her that it is definitely financially costly. Because of what the advisor said, she decides that eating meat is financially costly. Okay, so these two cases are a bit more, more closely matched. And now the question then is it reasonable for Sarah to defer to her trusted advisor in these cases? Well, Buckwalter thinks that when the cases are presented like this, our intuitions are probably going to start aligning in both cases. So maybe you think deference is fine in both cases, or maybe you think deference is problematic in both cases, but the difference between them no longer seems to be as significant. It doesn't seem like there's any... So, like, what the deference datum would say, if you think the deference datum is right, then you would say that deference in the moral case is just really weird. Right, that's really peculiar. So the moral case where Sarah forms the moral belief on the basis of what the moral advisor says, that's just very, very strange. Whereas in the financial case, it's perfectly fine. Right, it's obviously forming, a belief about the financial costs of an institution. Like, yeah, that's something that we can defer to others about. But Buckwalter thinks that's not what happens here. Right, like, it doesn't seem like deference is obviously crazy in the first case and perfectly fine in the second. It just, like, the cases just start to align. And that would suggest that there actually just isn't, the deference datum is just a mistake, right? There just isn't this significant difference between deference in the moral domain and deference in the non-moral domain. A third concern that Buckwalter raises is that it's not clear that people actually can form beliefs through deference in the sense that this has been defined in the literature on moral deference. So in the literature on moral deference, the idea is that I defer about some proposition P when I form the belief that P simply on the basis that another person holds the belief that P. And that's it, right? So my belief is based merely on the fact that this other person holds the belief. Now, this isn't the same as taking the other person's belief that P as one possible consideration in favour of P. No, the idea is you you are just complete, like, I'm just totally deferring to them, right? I'm kind of offloading all of my cognitive work onto the other person. The problem with this is that in any actual case of deference, or what we might call deference, I will have had plenty of previous exposure to the person to whom I'm deferring. I will have various feelings, memories, thoughts, background beliefs that influence why I'm trusting that person. So think about the case of deferring to the tax specialist. It actually doesn't seem reasonable to defer to just any random tax specialist. When I'm choosing an advisor, I'm going to make assessments of who is likely to be giving good advice. So, I mean, already there, like, okay, so I'm trusting this person. Maybe I'm deferring to them in some sense, right? I believe what they tell me, but I'm not just deferring to them, right? There's all of these background beliefs about who makes for a good advisor, and then moreover, when I'm given information from them, I'm going to reason about it to some degree myself. Because if their advice is just obviously incoherent, or it deviates significantly from common sense, or it seems to be illegal, then I'm not going to defer to them. Like it would clearly be crazy to defer to a tax specialist if you suspect that the advice they're giving is incoherent or illegal. So, like, I'm obviously running their advice through some sort of internal filter to some degree. But if all of that's going on, then the case of deference to a tax specialist isn't really a case of deference as it's defined in the moral deference literature. It's not that I'm forming the belief that P merely because the tax specialist believes that P. Rather, the tax specialist's belief that P is one relevant consideration among many. I'm weighing up a variety of different kinds of evidence before I form the belief that P. But then if we consider the idea of moral deference in that light, well, arguably it doesn't seem so deviant. If I know that Verity is a sensitive and careful moral thinker, if I know that her values tend to align with mine, well then, if she says that she thinks euthanasia is wrong, I might take that as one reason among many for thinking that euthanasia is wrong. She might, so her belief might influence my belief in that sense. So there's a sense in which I'm deferring, but like when we think about how deference, so in actual cases, when we form beliefs on the basis of what other people say, how does that actually work? Well, it's really more like a process of just weighing up all sorts of different considerations. And in that sense, moral deference doesn't seem so problematic, or so Buckwalter says. Okay, well, that's that. That's the end of that video. That was the puzzle of moral deference. I will end it there. Thank you for watching.